silence for all the victims of 9/11 on 9/11 and all the victims following 9/11. So please, let's close our eyes. Thank you. This is a day that we all remember. We remember where we were. I'm going to share where I was. I was teaching in Detroit and giving the children some little breakfast, and I was short on milk, and I ran down to get some more milk, and the janitor said, "Colleen, come here." And I went in, and he had a little TV, and I saw the first plane hit. And the first plane had hit, he said, "Look what happened." And I said, "Oh my gosh." I saw the second plane hit, and I said, "We're under attack." And I taught in a Detroit school that was just on the border of Dearborn. So the majority of my students were refugees from all the Middle Eastern wars. And the majority of them were Muslim. And so I had two classes. In my morning class, that's what happened. In the afternoon, none of the Muslim kids came. I got on the phone and I called all the students and talked to their parents and said, "Please limit the TV. We want your children not to feel fearful, and bring them to school tomorrow. Keep your life as normal as possible in this abnormal time." And I was the only teacher that had 100% attendance the next day, September 12th. That was because they knew I loved their children like my children. And that's what the Citizens for Peace is about. We believe that all children are our children, and there are no borders. And so we have a special program today. Every September since 2015, I had Dr. Saeed Khan come and talk to us. And you can get the programs on our website if you want to hear more of this brilliant man. And he said, "I love your group, Colleen, and if you ever need me, let me know." I said, "I need you every September." And he has fulfilled that promise. As busy as this man was this summer, he had just this little window traveling all over the world. Last year he had just gotten back from Saudi Arabia, meeting with the Crown Prince. He's been all over this summer, and he's going back to London tomorrow. He's been in Geneva and all over. He's on the radio, on TV. How many of you have heard him before? Well, that's why you're back. That explains it. He's so brilliant, and he has so much wisdom to share. And that's probably one of the reasons he is one of the favorite lecturers at Wayne State University. He has multiple roles: father, husband, wonderful professor. He's in MCHR, and he supports peace. And he's going to give a perspective not on really the past, but on the effect of the past and how we can move into the future with love and compassion, which was the biggest reaction of 9/11, by the way. Love and compassion around the world. And that's what we have to focus on. So get ready, put on your thinking caps, I used to say in elementary school, because we are going to think and feel and learn tonight from the wonderful Dr. Saeed Khan. Give him a big Citizens for Peace welcome.
I can project, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for being here. I know it's a solemn evening for all of us. I was giving a talk earlier at Rochester College where I co-teach on Christian-Muslim dialogue, which I have been now for the past 7 years. And ironically, I guess if it wasn't for 9/11, there wouldn't have been a catalyst for a course like this coming about. And we find that every year it becomes more and more transformative for the cohort of students that comes in. And one of the things that we shared with the students, and this of course then gets into that old issue of age, none of the students really remember 9/11. Oh, thanks, okay. Because even the oldest student there was probably about 3 or 4 years old on 9/11 in the year 2001. And so it was a difference between Barney and 9/11, and they were watching Barney. But I remember on that morning that made a cup of tea, turned on the Today Show, back when Matt Lauer was still on, and as Colleen said, saw them break to a shot of downtown New York with a smoke trail coming out of one of the 2 towers. And the thought that went through my mind, as I'm sure it did for you, is who was the silly traffic copter or the small plane that probably accidentally crashed into the building, except it was a perfectly blue sky day, so it really didn't make sense. I mean, they must have really messed up. And this is in the days before people were texting and flying. It's okay, most of them have autopilot, I hope. But of course, 17 minutes later, you saw the second plane hit the second tower, and it's remarkable how you can live an entire spectrum of emotions in 1 second. And I remember that morning, and I remember the entire day, because it was the first time that my landline, my cordless phone, the battery actually finally went out, that it needed to be recharged, because the phone rang constantly. People checking, are you okay? People calling and asking, what was that? And what was sad was how many Muslims were calling and saying, please, we hope it isn't us. The fact that that narrative had been something internalized going back to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and this kind of strange, almost perverse breathing a sigh of relief in 1995 when the Oklahoma City bombing was not perpetrated by Muslims. It was, of course, by nationalist extremist Timothy McVeigh and Jim and Terry Nichols. Now, here's the other irony. I have no connection to any Muslim terrorists, but I have a connection to the Oklahoma City bombing terrorists, because Jim and Terry Nichols went to my high school. Yeah. So I'm always intrigued when I have a conversation with my friends in the FBI. I'm like, if there's anything you're going to profile me about, it's that we all went to Lapeer High, not because of my religious affiliation or my country of origin. But as you know, things changed so dramatically from that time, and I have to be perfectly honest, were it not for 9/11, I would probably still be doing my old job, practicing law, or if I'm putting the band back together. The idea that this inadvertently thrust me into a whole different reality, it would be very, very awkward for me to say that I am grateful for 9/11, but in many ways, where my life has taken me is exactly due to what happened on that fateful day. But a lot has happened in the 17 years since then. And while we could go ahead and think that things have perhaps improved in the avenue of peace and a sense of love being fostered, unfortunately it seems as though some took 9/11 and the pretext of 9/11 to then become more combative and to serve as a justification for further conflict. And unfortunately, along with that, the profiteering from such conflict. So if you'll indulge me, we'll go through a few different avenues of where these 17 years have gone. And I promise you it won't take me 17 years to describe all of this. So when you take a look at the post-9/11 conflicts, of course, Afghanistan loomed large, and part of that is because Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan. There was, of course, also the very ill-fated war in Iraq, but then also how Al-Qaeda took on new incarnations beyond the borders of Afghanistan, having all of these cutesy acronyms like AQ, AP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, It's almost as though, quite rightly, Al-Qaeda had learned the business model of Western corporate structures by franchising. So the idea that they then had a branch in Iraq, they had a branch in Yemen, they had a branch in Jordan, speaks volumes about where the learning curve was in many of these organizations. And then, of course, the most recent incarnation of this being ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which was a splinter group of Al-Qaeda. In fact, was so extreme that even Al-Qaeda disavowed themselves from the lunacy of ISIS. But if you want to take a look at understanding what was going on in that part of the world, really what we're talking about is a form of causality. The idea of a causal chain from a certain action then having a reaction and further and so on. It's like for those of you who are watching the US Open over the weekend and saw the women's final, it clearly escalated into a full-out war on courtside with Serena Williams. And while many people have many opinions about the propriety of a rule that says you cannot coach and whether this was sexism and or racism, the original issue was a warning that was given by one coach. And so we find then that the snowball effect of what happened in New York City on Saturday seems to follow a similar track to how these conflicts tend to snowball in directions which seemingly are out of control, but unfortunately we find that through opportunism of policymakers, they pounced on the idea of 9/11 and exploited the death of 3,000 people to further other objectives that had been pre-existing since, in some cases, the late 90s. There was a document called the Project for the New American Century, which was drafted and then signed on by many of the architects of the policies that then were enacted in Afghanistan and particularly in Iraq. Names like Paul Wolfowitz, names like Jeb Bush, names like Francis Fukuyama, names of the so-called neoconservatives put together this manifesto which then served almost as a template for what they were going to do later. I don't know if they really had thought that they could come to fruition a mere 3 years later. They might have just gone ahead and signed this as an aspirational document, shoved it in some drawer somewhere, but they certainly didn't waste any time in dusting it off. If you take a look at the cost of the Afghan war, which by the way is still going on, there is still an American presence there. We have 31,000 Afghan civilians killed. We have 30,000 injured. 50,000 armed Afghans killed. For a country whose total population is roughly that of New York State. So you can see then the impact that it has. On the side of the United States, as of 2 years ago, we had lost roughly 2,400 troops, another 21,000 who were wounded. And the bill that we, as taxpayers, have been stuck with is around 1.1, and it's with a T, trillion dollars. I have at least 3 friends who have their cars in the garage right now because they have flat tires thanks to the roads here in Michigan. I'm not saying it would cost $1.1 trillion to turn everything around, but I'm sure it would certainly help with a lot of the other infrastructure that we have to endure.
Amen to that.
When it comes to the Iraq War, here are some more sobering numbers. 650,000 Iraqis killed, 200,000 by direct violence, another 1.5 to 2.5 million injured. They cannot actually come up with accurate statistics for this. Another 3.5 to 5 million displaced, both outside Iraq as well as internally displaced because of ethnic cleansing and because the situation is too toxic. And this for a country of 26 million people. So roughly Florida. 4,500 U.S. troops dead, 32,000 wounded, a veteran suicide rate of 22 per day as a direct consequence of the Iraq War. And as you see here, the financial costs are not only $1.7 trillion for the military, but another $500 billion for veterans benefits, and an estimated $6 trillion total bill in 4 decades. This, by the way, along with the fact that we have an increasing budget deficit, which is bigly. But if you were smart, if you had foresight, you would have started gobbling up shares the day after 9/11 in Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin. They have more than doubled their stock value as a result of 9/11. Someone has certainly made an awful lot of money based on that. Now, Iran is a fascinating country, and of course we know now that the current administration has certainly a different perspective on Iran than the previous administration did. I see my really dear friend here, Reverend Rich Peacock. He and I, along with others, advocated tirelessly, particularly to Michigan's senatorial duo, to persuade them to vote in favor of the Iran nuclear deal because it was good for peace, it was good for the United States, it was good for the world, and it could even be good for Michigan's economy with the opening of Iran and the removal of sanctions. We probably should have talked to a few other people. I'm not sure if it would have done much good, but we find now there's a different posture to this agreement that was really spearheaded by the Obama administration, and yet the United States now is the one country that has withdrawn from it. The other 5 are still trying very, very earnestly to try to keep the agreement in place. There you go. Here's a picture of Iran. And this is President Hassan Rouhani, who's been in office since 2013. He is regarded as a moderate, and he is someone who has to fend off not only the toxicity coming out of Washington, but also the toxicity coming out of the hardliners in Iran. So in many ways, he's really trying to push back 2 rather large elephants, which makes you wonder how much in common the hardliners of Iran and the administration in Washington currently have in common. It's like the horseshoe. Everything sort of comes back and connects over here. I had the opportunity to actually meet President Rouhani twice for the opening of the United Nations General Assembly, which occurs in September. The Iranian mission was kind enough to invite me. They said, "We'd like to thank you." I said, "What did I do?" They said, "Well, we heard you on NPR giving a very balanced analysis of why the Iran nuclear deal is good, so we thought that you might want to come in." I said, "Well, you know, Persian food, good. New York City, good. Meeting President Rouhani, not bad." And so I was struck by his brilliance. Here's a man who realizes that not only is he a custodian of a country that is pretty much summarily demonized and vilified, particularly in the United States and in other quarters, has been under sanctions now in a very deep way, affecting its economy for at least 3 decades. And yet, here's an individual who, when he speaks, has a very conscious recognition of the scope of Iranian and Persian history. So when he speaks, he actually speaks not just of the last 20 years or 40 years since the Iranian Revolution. He speaks in terms of millennia. And he was describing Iranian civilization as being 3 millennia old, going all the way back to Cyrus, Xerxes, and Darius, the great Persian emperors. The best we could come up with is about 240 years. We'll catch up at a certain point. But the fact that he was hearkening back to a culture that is so vibrant and so rich, and the idea then that it is his solemn duty as the ruler of Iran, as the elected ruler of Iran, to maintain the legacy of something that is so thousands of years old. And it then speaks volumes about whether such an individual is really going to then be nihilistic and risk nuclear holocaust by then endangering not only his people, but also this legacy that is thousands of years old. It was very enlightening to hear him speak in those terms. His foreign minister, Javed Zarif, who got his PhD at the University of Denver, was with him. And I asked him a question. I said, Excellency, I said, my students and my radio audience are oftentimes looking for a simplified answer for very complex questions. What advice could you give somebody like me? And he thought about it, and then later on, as we were all disassembling, he grabs him by the wrist, and he speaks, of course, fluent English, because he was also the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. He says, we've got an answer for you for your students and your audiences. I said, I'm all ears. He says, tell them that along with paying attention to the words that we use, that they should pay attention to the words we don't use. And I was like, wow. It was so nuanced, and I told him, I said, it's no wonder you guys invented chess. But understanding how particularly nice it is to see someone who cares about the economy of language, the nuance of language, and using full sentences. Something to behold. Saudi Arabia is apparently our new best friends in the region. Very curious, given the fact that the FBI seemed to understand that Saudi Arabia had more than just a passing involvement with 9/11. The fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. The fact that, and some of you might remember this, one of the eeriest things that happened after 9/11 was the fact that the skies were blue overhead. Living here in Detroit, we are used to contrails from airplanes, flying back and forth, if not ones that actually emanate or are landing at Metro Airport, certainly ones that are flying cross-country as they're going and whizzing past Detroit. But that week after 9/11 was really eerie because there were no contrails. As you recall, the United States had closed U.S. airspace to any flights. The only thing which broke that was that there was an F-16 that was scrambled, I think, out of Selfridge Air Force Base, and it did a loop over downtown Detroit. So the only thing worse than, of course, no contrails is seeing contrails in a circle, highly unnatural. But during that time, there were flights that were underway, and it was to ferry Saudi nationals out of the country. It shows then the kind of relationship that the U.S. and the Saudis have had for, well, decades, since Saudi Arabia became a kingdom in 1932. But it was also fascinating to see how much was overlooked or purposely neglected and ignored in favor of oil relationships, despite the fact that there was this buy-in that Saudi Arabia had in a violation of our sovereignty and certainly of the loss of life. And it's almost like the movie East of Eden, for those of you, or the book, if you've read the Steinbeck, the idea of two brothers, and one being sort of the black sheep, and one being the one favored. Iran is always seen as the black sheep of the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia in